Right, folks, there you heard Hand in Glove, and sitting here in the orchestra pit is Morrissey, the catalyst and main man in etc. from the Smiths. Welcome, Morrissey.
Hello, thank you.
Morrissey, as a kid growing up in Manchester, did you actually plan to be a singer? Did you foresee that?
I did, in a very underhand way. I knew I had to have something to do with popular music because it impressed me so much. It was the only thing that I really ever cared about. And as I grew older, I realised that it was really the last refuge for young people. They didn't have anything else. Certainly where I came from, which was a working class background, people didn't have any money to do anything. All they had really was their records. And this one record that they bought a week was more precious to them than anything. And I realised that, and I wanted to be involved somehow.
And who were your heroes?
I had many. I was an ardent consumer from a very, very early age. I bought all the usual popular records of the 1960s. I seemed to like everybody. For some obscure reason, I really was more impressed by the female voices. People like Sandie Shaw, Cilla Black, Marianne Faithfull. And I seemed to like them more so than the groups, which I always thought was really quite strange until I later met other people who felt exactly the same way.
But I mean, were they kind of pin-ups to you, or what?
Well, they were. I mean, I don't know how much of a pin-up those people can be to somebody of the age of 6 or 7, but I do remember feeling something incredibly passionate about the whole thing. But yes, they seem to be almost everything to me.
And who do you remember, Morrissey, going to see live? What was the first live gig you saw?
The first live gig I saw was T-Rex in 1972, which was, again, very, very passionate, but it didn't last very long with me. It was just something very brief.
You seem to be well keen on two chaps who sort of are, I suppose, kind of outside the pop music thing, Oscar Wilde and James Deane.
Yeah, that's true. For most of my life, at any rate, these two people have always meant a great deal to me, which always sounds very silly and always sounds very as if I'm living in a complete world of fantasy. But they always did mean a great deal to me, and they still do. I find as time goes by, they mean even more to me.
Well, would you be kind enough to explain, first of all, the James Deane thing?
Well, I think I was really more impressed with his life off the screen. I was never really terribly impressed by anything that he put, any of his film works. I always thought they were quite disposable. But his own history, his personal life, and his death, of course, just had immense appeal to me. And I always thought he was a wonderful stylist. Almost everything that he wore was absolutely perfect. And his own personal history was really quite special, and to me quite compulsive.
Do you think one of the attractions there is that physically, anyway, he ceased to exist?
No, because I don't feel that way about people. I mean, there's lots of people who have died, and I don't feel the same way. It is something quite different. I don't know what it was. I think it was because I became so attached to him at a very early age, and that was important to me, because he was really one of the first people who ever really impressed me, who made me think about life. And I can see this as being very, very trite and very, very childish, and when people tell me that it is, I can understand what they mean. But nonetheless, I still feel this strange, mystical passion, if that's what it is.
And what about Oscar Wilde, Morrissey?
Oscar Wilde is more or less the same story, really. Every solitary line that he ever wrote, it just stirred me immensely. And I can still reread all the works, and it's as if I'm reading them for the first time. I do like the element of tragedy that was in his life. The fact that he was hounded and imprisoned, and it had a wonderful, there's a wonderful tragic element to it that I really like.
Do you have a favourite line of his?
Yes, I do. Possibly the best one is, for me at any rate, is the artist must educate the critic, which sounds terribly snobby and very patronising, but in a way it's almost true.
Would you like to explain your interpretation of that?
Well, I don't dislike the music press by any means, but I do get slightly upset when certain writers virtually destroy the lives of particular artists, And because at the end of the day, I feel that all the people that write for the music press are basically fans of music, and their lives are obviously chiseled by the musical past. So therefore, when I see scathing reviews and horrible things written about people, it does upset me. So I always think of this line, the artist must educate the critic. In many, many instances it isn't true, but I think for those solitary instances when it really is true, I think the line makes perfect sense.
And if you just tuned into the BPFO, we've got Morrissey from the Smiths here. Earlier on, a few moments ago, we were talking about James Deane, and you mentioned his style, and also Oscar Wilde. And it seems to me that if one becomes famous, a lack of being deliberately fashionable visually actually becomes a style. And in your case, I mean, the baggy jeans, the shirt flapping about and not tucked in, and that's your image now.
It's absolutely perfectly true. But you know, when you come into the public eye, regardless of how you dress or what you do, is construed as an image. And this is something that is completely unavoidable. I always really quite consciously made an effort never to have an image. But of course, things don't quite turn out that way.
But I mean, say you got up in the morning and you decided to, among all the banging here, decided to wear a balaclava helmet and gumboots or something. Would you be conscious of the fact that it wouldn't be what your style has now become?
Yes, I think I would be slightly conscious, yes.
Well, I mean, that's a bit far-fetched, but you know what I mean?
I do, yes. Of course, I mean, unavoidably one does think about these things. And I really do think about now the way people see me. And to some people, many people, it has become quite important. So I just try not to upset those people, but I don't want to get caught into a trap, and I don't want to be strangled by flowers or whatever. And it can quite easily happen.
Well, let's talk about another visual aspect of the Smiths, Morrissey. I mean, you're heavily involved in designing the record sleeves and everything.
Yes.
And you seem to have a very strong interest in movie stars for packaging records. I mean, one example that comes to mind is Terence Stamp on the front of What Difference Does It Make? Well, now, first of all, before we talk about why that had to be changed, what was the idea there?
Well, the idea is just quite entirely selfish. I had if you can hear me.
Okay, there's a fierce sort of woodpecker invading the orchestra pit here, man.
Yes. It was entirely selfish. I had the picture for a long time and I really liked it. It seemed to convey this particularly appealing bedsit failure kind of image. These kind of people who think they're poets and they're artists and they live in bedsits and they just remain there forever. And that's exactly what the picture evoked to me. And to me that was quite special and passionate. So, but with all the sleeves, it's entirely selfish. I just use them because I want to. They have some kind of appeal. But most of the pictures I've had for a very long time.
From your own collection?
Yes.
Well, before we talk about some of the other sleeves, there's a heavy woody woodpecker thing there. Before we talk about the other sleeves, I mean, why did you actually have to change the Terence Stamp picture? What sort of legal scams went down there?
It was really quite strange, but suddenly he really didn't want the picture to appear at a time when it was really too late and quite a few thousand had gone out. And so it had to be changed quite dramatically. He asked that the picture be changed for a modern one, which made no sense to me whatsoever.
Right.
And also, without being cruel, but being perfectly blunt, I really thought that he would really quite relish being thrust into, if you like, virtually youth culture.
Yes.
Because I felt that perhaps his career was at the stage where he might need it. But apparently he was really quite stroppy about the whole thing, but he could have been more so. I mean, he could have really taken serious legal action. There was reports in English newspapers that he was suing me personally for extortionate amounts of money, and there were some totally fabricated quotes from me. I don't know where they came from, but it was really quite tragic. At one point, he sent a representative to Liverpool when we were playing there, and they said, if we don't remove the sleeve, we will be sued immediately. So it did get quite serious. It had to be replaced by a picture of me imitating his pose, which I thought was horrible. I thought the sleeve was dreadful.
Well, now on the album cover, Morrissey, you have a picture of Joe D'Alessandro. I mean, are you a great fan of all the Warhol school?
Not to the smallest degree. And I do feel quite a twinge of sadness now that is what the sleeve is. Not because I've gone off the picture, because I really like it, but I never really wanted to be pinned to the whole Warhol school or whatever. But the picture again was just quite evocative to me and provoking, slightly provoking, not in a terribly dangerous way, although some people will see it that way. And to me, to walk past famous newsagents and record shops and to see it in the window next to other sleeves is really quite gleeful.
Well, you've got Rita Tushington on the Sandie Shaw record, her version of Hand in Glove.
Yes.
But then on the latest single, Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now, and incidentally, congratulations on being the highest entry in the British charts this week.
Thank you.
Number 19. On that sleeve, you've got a picture of a lady whose life, it seems to me, was embraced by a whole bunch of tragedy, Viv Nicholson.
Yes, it's absolutely true. It's quite interesting that this year a film is being made about her in America, and that Bette Midler is playing the role of Viv Nicholson. So it's really quite coincidental that it should happen.
Well, would you be kind enough, Morrissey, to explain the life and times of that lady, Viv Nicholson?
Well, I think it would take several days, but briefly, she is known here for her pools win in 1961. She won the pools, and at the time it was the largest amount that anybody had ever won, largest amount.
What was it?
It was £175,000.
Not bad.
Well, no, I think in those days it was seen as something like, $1 million. It was completely unspendable. But she proved that it was completely spendable. She spent it incredibly quickly, and throughout the few years that she actually had money, she was totally dogged by tragedy. She went through 4 husbands, and most of them died. And she ended up singing in a nightclub, a strip club, and she was just chased by tragedy throughout these few years. She was never out of the English newspapers for one reason or another. At one point, the headlines in the newspaper were "Viv defies the Pope," because she wanted to open a club in Malta, a strip club, and the Pope had come hot on her heels trying to track her down. So she was always the object of the most colourful and outrageous newspaper nonsense imaginable.
And what's happened to her now?
Now she still lives in the place where she lived when she won the pools, Castleford in Yorkshire. And she's a little older, but I think she's still, from the recent conversation I had, she still seems quite alive and quite a colourful character. I want to meet her very, very soon.
I'm sure you will.
I hope so.
Let's talk about another lady who, thank goodness, hasn't had the same amount of misfortunes and still shines beautifully, Sandie Shaw.
Well, yes, she's had some misfortune recently, of course.
Oh, what was that?
Well, Hand in Glove, probably.
Heavy, humble by lemon. I mean, the yarn goes that you wrote her piles and piles of fan letters.
That's entirely untrue.
Really?
That is completely untrue. I think
she's actually said that.
I know, she says it constantly. I can't understand why. I wrote her 2 letters, and I met her, and I asked her to make this record, and she was immediately game to do it. So it's just been a great success. I mean, it's so wonderful for me to have written the words that put Sandie back into the chart after a 15-year absence.
It's brilliant.
I mean, she had tried, she had made other records, but I think the problem was that she was just really, her entire career was controlled and orchestrated by the wrong people who were really too old to quite understand her.
Well, it seems even with younger people, I mean, BEF is a case in point. It didn't really work, did it?
It was a total tragedy, the whole thing. Heaven knows why she was singing Anyone Who Had a Heart. It's ridiculous, really.
Well, I think maybe the suggestion's been made that that's why they did it, because I mean it being associated with Cilla Black in England anyway.
Yes, but does that make sense? I don't know.
No, it doesn't.
No, but everything was wrong. The sleeve was wrong. The label was wrong. The photograph of Sandie was wrong. No.
Well, what was it like? I mean, were you actually a bit nervous meeting her?
I was for the first time because I held her in such enormous esteem. It was obviously quite naturally nerve-wracking. But she was very incredibly casual and down-to-earth, even though she was slightly mistrusting. She wasn't really quite sure about me. I think she thought I was this strange, perverse figure. I don't know, she had her own ideas anyway. But it seemed that we just immediately hit it off in a really positive way. And the whole experience has been really quite joyful.
But my favourite track on that record actually is on the 12-inch, Morrissey, Jeane.
Yes.
Tell us about that song.
Well, that's a very, very old song that Johnny and I wrote when we first met. We originally put our own version on the back of This Charming Man,
right.
and it was really quite a terrible version. The production was entirely wrong, and the voice was completely invisible. So that was quite a disaster, and I felt really sad because I felt that it was a very good song, and it had been wasted, it had been thrown away. So I played it to Sandie, and seconds later she was singing it. So I personally feel that her version on the 12-inch is perhaps the best of the three songs. And I do feel slight regret that it was squashed away as a third track on a 12-inch, but never mind.
Having heroes like people like Oscar Wilde, James Dean, Cilla Black, Marianne Faithfull, and of course Sandie Shaw, even T-Rex, at school, how did people react to this?
Violently, because it was always really off the accepted mark. I came from quite a hard working class school, and it was always really quite difficult for me to talk about the people that I liked, because it was always entirely perverted, and it was entirely pompous and intellectual. Everybody liked Slade, and that was the highest degree of intellect that could ever be discovered. And if you talked about people like Cilla Black, you were just simply locked away in a cupboard, or you were beaten to a pulp. So it's really quite difficult. It's impossible in working class schools to appreciate Oscar Wilde. It's impossible virtually to find an Oscar Wilde book for some unfathomable reason. Young people in working class schools aren't supposed to care about poetry. All they're supposed to care about is woodwork. It's really quite interesting in these kind of schools that the only subjects that you're pushed towards and you're allowed to be enthusiastic about are manual ones. It always seems that inevitably when you leave school you will do some manual job. You will do something connected with metalwork, you will work at a lathe, or you will do woodwork, which to me was always entirely repellent. I only ever really cared about reading and athletics, I suppose. But it's difficult.
But it seems to me the reason for that, Morrissey, is because most schools are sort of government-controlled biscuit factories.
Exactly. That is the reason.
Did you actually get bullied at school?
No, I never did. I never got bullied, and it's really quite curious because I suppose I really deserve to be. But I never got bullied because I was quite a model athlete. And I think regardless of the fact that you like Cilla Black or whatever, if you're very good at athletics, this is something that people will completely, other kids will really approve of. And you can overcome almost any musical influences just by the fact that you can play football really well. So I suppose if I really had been a weakling in that area, and I wasn't, I really loved athletics in every direction. If I had been a total wimpy person, I wouldn't have lasted terribly long. But this always saved me, the fact that I was the person that everybody always picked first to be on the football team, etc.
Well, was there actually a potential conflict between music and sports? I mean, did you ever think, well, I'd like to be a superstar footballer?
No, I never thought that, because I always considered football to be the area of no intellect, and it was always really terribly important to me. I'm sure that will insult millions of people, and I'm sure I'll be stoned to death in the streets. But my grand passion was running, and when I left school, I no longer ran, and it was an enormous tragedy to me. I had to give it up, and I had to become completely immersed in books. But I won lots of medals for running, and that was always really quite the enormous glory of my entire youth. And I do miss it now, and I think it's quite sad that I can't bound about anymore.
Well, why can't you?
I don't know. I feel slightly trapped. I think I feel quite silly. I don't know. This is where it gets really neurotic, I'm afraid. I don't know. I mean, I'm speechless.
Well, I mean, somebody like Michael Jagger, right, from a well-known group, is known to do 5-mile runs and things before a tour every 5th year.
I know. I'd like to get round to it. I'd like somebody out there to grab me and shove me on a track, and I'd be away.
All right, we'll ask volunteers to write in.
I hope.
Morrissey, you don't, I mean, there seems to be sort of video mania at the moment, right? It seems to be sort of part of the music business, or maybe the music schmizness, the schmuck and roll side of things, travel logs and things, you know.
Yes.
You don't, I get the impression you're not madly keen on them.
we'll never ever do a video, never. And I feel quite proud of the fact that our album entered the British chart at #2 without a video, without any degree of promotion whatsoever. So many people had said to me that we'd never do it without a video. And when I told people months and months ago that we wouldn't even consider a video, they thought it was total insanity. But I'm really pleased because we did it anyway, and it ultimately proves that the making of a video proves nothing, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be of any value. And I think it's the whole idea of videos have got boring. I think the people who make them are bored, and I'm quite convinced that people are bored watching them. So I think it's time that they took their exit.
I mean, that's very unlikely, though.
I don't know. I think things are changing slightly, because we are hearing people for the first time denouncing the video when it hadn't happened previous to the beginning of this year, and the synthesizer is going. Last year, when I would talk about the synthesizer and videos and say how repellent they were, people would generally think that I was quite mad. But now it's quite interesting to hear synthesizer-based groups like the Human League using guitars in a very aggressive way. So I think things are changing slightly. You don't sound convinced.
There's some videos I like, most videos I dislike intensely, because it seems to me that often the music is secondary, which is cockeyed.
Well, of course, I mean, this is always the principle, and this is what really upsets me so much, that the music is just really hurled into the background. And I always feel that if a record is really good, it won't need anything, it won't need a video. The record should stand on its own and sell itself, because people didn't need elaborate videos in the 1960s. They would just stand up on a stage virtually naked before the world, and they were completely riveting. But now people hide behind the most surreal settings, and it's totally absurd, because what it ultimately means is that they are saying, me as a person, as a singer, as an artist, I am not good enough just to stand up and sing. I have to have this fabrication. I have to be in this wonderful elaborate setting, otherwise people won't buy my record.
Right. Well, Morrissey, and if you just tuned into the BPFO, there's still time to catch a bit of verbal from Morrissey from the Smiths. Morrissey, you've been quoted as saying, and I quote, "The sexes have allowed themselves to be too different." Would you be kind enough to explain what you mean?
Seems I have to explain everything.
Right, and that's what you're here for. I mean, two of the people about whom we talked earlier, Oscar Wilde and James Deane, did have a very sort of complex sexual situation. Putting it in one way, right?
Yes, to put it mildly, yes.
Yes, put it mildly. And in fact, not only was it complex, but I mean, other people couldn't handle it either. You know, and gave them a hard time because of it, an intolerable time.
That's true. That's true. And I think that's a grain of their appeal for me. But what I really mean by this statement is that I find that within the world, but certainly within popular music very strongly, there is this enormous division and this segregation between the sexes. And I think in life it's really quite ultimately destructive, because it means that in many ways people don't get to know each other or appreciate each other. I hate the macho thing, which is still very strong in popular music, the big hefty he-man. I really despise that. But in fact I hate any kind of extreme behaviour, whether it's the machismo thing or the reverse. So when I write words, I just write for an invisible person. I don't write for male, or I don't write for female, because I think then there is a stronger chance that whatever I write can appeal to almost anybody. Sometimes I'm wrong, but hopefully in some severely isolated incidents I'm right. Because, you know, I think it's really quite boring to separate and to segregate, and things are bad enough in the world as it is without any further additions to isolating people.
Well, people write you a whole bunch of letters, don't they, with all their sort of their deepest problems and anxieties and things, and you're turning into some sort of electronic guru or something.
Yes, it's completely true, yes.
I mean, how do you react to that? I mean, being a pop singer, right, and people write as if you're some sort of guru who's just landed on this planet to cast wisdom to and fro with bunches of flowers. Yeah. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, most of the time I feel quite sad, because people write to me incredibly serious and monumental letters, about the state of their life, and they say, obviously, Morrissey, you will understand completely and you will be able to help me. And which, of course, I can't because of the amount of mail that I get. It's impossible to reply. And also, in some instances, I don't want to, because I feel that if I reply, I'm virtually getting personally involved. And then people rewrite and say, why have you deserted me?
Or why didn't it work?
Yes. I mean, it's quite a hopeless situation. But I do try to reply to people as much as possible, because we don't have a fan club or anything like that, and we never will have an answering service. It's really quite important that we keep in close contact with people as much as possible, but sometimes it's dangerous.
How do you mean?
Well, people write to me about very serious issues like suicide, and there is no really sensible answer, because it's impossible to give advice to a person that, let's face it, I don't know.
Well, do you personally enjoy being a pop star?
I enjoy most of it. Most of it I enjoy. Sometimes there are very bleak moments. It isn't a life of complete candy floss and endless glamour, but I can't think of anything else on earth that I'd rather do. It's quite easy and it's quite boring to sit down and complain about certain things like being in a studio or being interviewed or having to go somewhere. But I remember less than a year ago, when I was rigid with boredom and entirely depressed, and I had absolutely nothing. And when I just think about those periods, I just realise that now I'm just incredibly lucky. So I'll never forget those times when I really wanted to do this.
Well, is Morrissey? I mean, we've gone through some of the lyrics of "Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now." Are you a miserable bloke?
Yeah, I think so. I try very hard to be. No, I think I am. I think I'm afraid there's something ingrained in me which will always make me see the black side. In many instances, I think this is entirely protective, because it's virtually entirely realistic. And so most of the time I'm really quite pleased. But yes, I'm afraid I am quite a sour old cabbage.
Well, apart from that sort of vegetarian vibe there, do you actually like yourself?
No, not really. It's quite difficult. The only things that have made me feel any degree of satisfaction is when I close the door at night and I sit down and I listen to this charming man, or I look at the records and I do have some sense of gleeful satisfaction, and it does make me feel that perhaps, after all, everything is worthwhile. But previous to that, I just felt totally worthless, disposable human being. I think you have to have some sense of achievement in your life. You have to feel as though you've done something. Otherwise, you're just an anonymous blob, and you feel that if you disappeared tomorrow, nobody would know. But I don't feel that anymore.
All right, well, Morrissey, may the blob never land on you. For being in the orchestra. Thank you very much, man.
Thank you.